Hey there, spacers. This is Rick Tumlinson. You are tuned into the space revolution here on iRock Space Radio. We're part of the iHeartRadio network family. And today we have an interesting guest, an old friend. And He's not representing a company or anything like that. I'm bringing him on because I consider him to be a top expert in the realm of space policy. And although we don't always agree on everything, we come from the same place and we have the same goals. So his name is Aaron Oesterle. And he's been a policy activist 10 years or more. Aaron is somebody you don't see a lot of in public. He is working behind the scenes, getting stuff done, as they say. And that's very impressive to me. He's the kind of guy who and has sort of prepared statements, policy statements, and all kinds of things for all kinds of organizations, and Congress people and things like that. He works behind the scenes, and so you see the work, but you maybe don't realize who's done the work. He helped draft the Space Exploration Development and Settlement Bill that went through the House and Senate, and it actually influenced a lot of other legislation that followed it. And he's been a board member of the Space Frontier Foundation for many, many years, the organization I started back in the 20th, as we like to say. He graduated University of Michigan, aerospace engineering, and a minor in science, technology, and society, and he's currently pursuing a grad degree in space studies at the University of North Dakota. And just a really good friend. So welcome, Aaron.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, yeah. It's always good to talk to you. You keep me. It's one of those things that you keep your head up at the top, and I try to make sure that we're not anchored down too much.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, we always have fun conversations. The worst thing I can say about Aaron is that he's a good listener, which for somebody like me who likes feedback, and he's just a very quiet listener, which means he's thinking, which terrifies me. So, Aaron, look, we're in a moment of transition. You can tell by the name of the show. You know, you've been an integral part of this, the space revolution, and I guess the first thing I want to ask you before we get into some specific policies and topics and things like that is, what is the core thing in front of you right now? What is the main thing that you are focused on right now in Washington?
So, I am currently rebuilding and helping to strengthen the Space Frontier Foundation's policy team. We have a lot of old hats, we have some new hats, and I was brought back in to help because I was in for a while and then I stepped back because they were doing a lot of other things and I wanted to focus on some other things. They asked me to come back and help step that up, and I've been focused on that, and so we are reestablishing kind of issues we have, issues we want to focus on, policies we want to see enacted, that kind of a thing. We're one of our a lot. There's a lot of reactivity in terms of what we do because it's just how policy is made in terms of this president will put out a statement or the chair of the science committee will put out a statement or there will be a draft bill and then we have to react to it. So there's a lot of reaction to various things. One of our big things that we're trying to see enacted is a national strategy for space solar power. We see a lot of potential in space solar power that's not being addressed, and so we're talking to the National Space Council people, we're talking to NASA people. There's a report coming out from NASA in the near future. I
Mm-hmm.
stress that in quotes because of how government work just takes time. They were hoping to have it out in October, is my understanding, and then it got delayed, and then it got delayed again, and then it got delayed again. So it's just how government works, and you have to work with the system as opposed to always trying to fight against the system. It doesn't always work when you're fighting against the system, but if you can make those turns very carefully, you get much more reaction that you want to see happen.
Can you explain that for a second? What do you mean? Make those turns very
Think of it
gradually.
think of it a lot like a battleship or an aircraft carrier or a big cruise ship. You don't turn on a dime. It never will. It just, the momentum is too much. The bureaucratic inertia of trying to change government policy is such that you have to understand, you know, who's president, who's chairman, who's the political actors, who are the non-political actors, how are they influencing the various aspects of policy. Where do they want to go? How many more years till an election is coming up? All those things make for very slow change at times. There are times when change happens quickly, but it's usually like a big tragedy or something horrific has happened. Loss of the space shuttle, declaration of war, those kind of things will change things quickly. But generally it's slow. So you have to find the points of inflection where you can say, okay, let's go in and talk to this congressman or that senator or that policymaker and get them to understand why we're talking about this issue and how it can impact whatever it is we're talking about.
Mhm. Do you find that when you're talking to these people, and I'm sure it's a spectrum, I guess, but do you have to play to their specific self-interest? Like, you've got a factory in your district, or do you find them operating at a different level, maybe sort of a national level? Is it,
It
or is it
varies.
a mix?
I mean, it really does vary depending on the policymaker you're talking to. If you're talking to a congressman, I've literally been in a room with a congressman staffer, and we were presenting our various issues, and he literally looks at one of the things that we had was a letter written by a bunch of companies, and he literally looks at it and he goes, "Okay, this isn't my state. This isn't my state. This isn't my state. Okay, okay, I have a constituent interest. Okay, great. I'll respond to this." And that was literally his response. It was like, I just want to see my constituents. On the other hand, you'll have people who are very esoteric. They see a big picture, they see a vision, they have an idea behind them, they have a strategy behind them. And those people, you can engage with them really, in some ways, really beautifully. But if you're on opposing sides, it's harder to do that. A great example, if I can give this is a few years old, but there was a push to federalize certain lawsuits if there was an accident involving a spacecraft company, and the response was from the trial lawyers was, no, we don't want to do that because trial lawyers do not like to see these kind of things federalized for a variety of reasons. And there was a very esoteric reason, which goes back to their philosophical thing related to how they approach policymaking, not necessarily how they approach space issues, but policymaking.
So, yeah, obviously the lawyers didn't like it because if it's murky, they get a lot of good lawsuits and such. I worked on the state level here in Texas, as you know. So, but so in some cases it's completely transactional. You go in, the senator, the congressperson's like, okay, I got this company in my district, and you know, oh, good, it's going to help them, right? Or they've signed this letter. Oh, that means some of these people who maybe donate to me or maybe will donate to me care about this topic. And then you're saying others are very sort of they have their own vision, they're driven by an agenda that is a macro agenda. So,
Exactly,
which
exactly.
one of the two is easiest?
Um, the easiest is when they agree with you on a macro level. Then you don't
Mm.
have to do a lot of convincing because it's just like, hey, we're here to talk about space solar power, and we see this as a green tech, and they'll love it for whatever reason. On the other hand, if they're I think like it's kind of like the transactional ones are the mid tier one. The easiest is when they agree with you and have a big picture vision. Mid tier is when they're completely transactional, and you just have to approach it from a transactional issue. Do they care about this issue, or can you find somebody in their district who cares about this issue? Um, the, the worst is when they have a vision, but they're opposed to you. Um, in that situation, you're just kind of like, what the hell do I do? Because you have these, you have a real ideology behind you, and staffers or congressmen are very focused on their vision. And if their vision doesn't mesh with your vision, it's you know it's
Mhm.
a fight.
So it's kind of like they've got their brand, they've got their and everybody in their staff, they all share the boss's brand, and as we know, it's the staffers who get things
Oh
done.
yes.
Um, so, like, if you're going to go, you're going to go walk into Bernie Sanders' office, right? Um, I'll give you a couple of challenging ones. What would you say to Bernie Sanders in terms of space solar power?
I would say that if you regard climate change as one of the quintessential crises of our times, which I think he does, I do, I know you do, um, then everybody has to pull their weight. Every agency should be putting in their 2 cents on how to help climate change. And that includes organizations like NASA, like Space Force. And this is a way they can do their share without losing sight of what other agencies and organizations want to do. We don't want to have a, I mean, again, going back to my fundamentals, if climate change is a major crisis that we have to address, then you don't want to fight between space solar power and ground solar, or space solar power and fusion, or any of that kind of stuff. You want to bring everybody to the table, and everybody brings their A game. You just can't afford to have anything else. And so that would be my
Okay.
pitch to somebody like a Bernie Sanders.
So let's say I'm Bernie. I won't do the voice. I can't do the voice, whatever. But whatever, whatever. Anyway, so I'm Bernie, and I'm like, well, I really have a problem with this whole commercial space thing because it's these rich guys and these billionaires, and they should be giving their money away, and um, they're going to be the guys who benefit. They're the ones trying to leave the planet, and so why should I support space solar power? Especially, we got we just had this breakthrough with fusion. So why should I support that? What do you say to somebody like that?
Generally, I go by.
And just to be clear, I think that when he says that, he's coming from a place, and those are rationales that he's throwing at you.
I
So how do
think
you dance with that?
I think it's one of those things. You come back to the issue of again, is this a how much money are you going to spend on space? If you truly believe that you shouldn't be spending any money on space, then we're at a standstill. But if your attitude is we're going to spend some amount of money on space, and it's going to be X billion dollars, then it should be solving major critical issues. Example being, climate change. And yes, it's great that we can do all this observation stuff from space, and we should do more of that. But by the same token, we can do more. We should do more. If we're not bringing our gay game to this issue, then we're not trying.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the issue of commercialization versus government institutions, what you want effective policy strategies, and you have to have methods and ways to approach that. And commercialization is not the same thing as privatization. That's one of the key things that I always come back to. People equate the two, but they're not the same. They're very fundamentally different issues. And privatization is it's something that a lot of liberals, myself included, sometimes have a problem with, because it takes it approaches everything as a net zero sum game. And that is a dangerous attitude in a lot of our opinions. At least in my opinion. I should say our opinion because I'm not speaking for anybody but myself. Um, but I see that attitude reflected. Whereas commercialization it's about taking something and finding a broader use for it that everybody can take part in. Whether it's whether it's that's what we did with the internet. Now we have a lot of problems with the internet in terms of like social media and so forth, but fundamentally we're never going to get rid of the internet because it does too much for too many people, and we commercialized it in a manner that allowed for everybody to approach the issue from an attitude of I can be a part of this, and that was very powerful. That's a very powerful world when the individual can approach something and say I am part of this, as opposed to a company. It's so that's kind of how I would approach somebody like a Bernie Sanders.
Okay. Very interesting. I like the little case study thing here. So we're going to swing back in here in a minute. My name is Rick Tumlinson with my guest Aaron Oesterle. You're listening to the Space Revolution here on iRock Space Radio, and we'll be right back. All right, Spacers, welcome back to the Space Revolution. My name is Rick Tumlinson. We have our guest, Aaron Oesterle. We're having sort of a free range conversation with some basic focus elements, in this case, policy and getting policies passed. These are very critical, and there's a difference between policies and regulations and funding and all of that. But Aaron's an expert in this area. One of those guys I can literally picture Aaron in a suit going through the tunnel between the House and the Senate with a big stack of folders and notebooks in his arm.
Nowadays, everybody just carries their tablet
Right.
or their computer.
That's true. Okay, I went old school on you, but I do remember that. I've seen you with a big pile of notebooks and folders in your arm. But you're right. Nowadays, we're very modern. A tiny little chip held between your finger and thumb. But anyway, so into the policy stuff here. Continuing on that, we were just talking about space solar power. I want to specifically ask you about this one though, because it does concern me. As you know, we both know, space solar power has been sort of the unicorn of the space field for decades for the activist side of things. And for those of you who don't know what space solar power is, it's basically the collection of sunlight in space, like you would do on your roof if you have a solar power collector, and then it's converted into radio waves or microwaves, and they're beamed down to the Earth and translated back into electrical signals and sent to power your home. The sun shines 24 hours a day in space. You can build as big as you want. So there's a lot of arguments for it. One of the reasons that those who want to see human communities in space have grabbed onto it is because it's a mega project, and it's the kind of project that would employ a lot of people. It would involve a lot of infrastructure development, a lot of industrial development, and that is critical to building an economy in space. So that's one reason that space people get so excited about. Some space people get so excited about space solar power. The challenge now, though, there's these recent discussions of fusion energy. I wrote on LinkedIn or somewhere, I was talking about the idea that, it's going to be on the same timeline, which, by the way, both space solar power and fusion energy have been characterized over the last few decades of being always 10 years away. But now both of them may be happening within 10 years. It's quite conceivable. They could both come online. It would seem that fusion energy would put space solar power potentially out of business. But interestingly, for those of us who want to see human communities in space, fusion energy helps enable the rapid expansion of humanity into the solar system all by itself, because it lowers the cost of creating energy in space. It's a whole bunch of different things. You can use it for vehicle power, propulsion, things like that. How do you drive those two? How do you is space solar power still worth pushing for at a period where we think we might have fusion? I'll put it that way.
I think that the short answer is it's still worth pushing for because we we have a theoretical breakthrough on fusion. We do not have commercial fusion. There's a huge difference between commercial fusion and the breakthrough we've had. Now, I'm excited about fusion because for a variety of reasons. You listed a whole bunch of good reasons to be excited about fusion right now. But from my perspective, we don't have the solution state that we absolutely need from one or the other. And this is why I go back to when you talk to policymakers who are of the mindset that climate change is real and you have to address it, or even just energy independence and you have to address it. You want an all of the above. You want everybody bringing their A game. Why not have NASA be a part of that? Why not have Space Force be a part of that? Why not have the Office of Space Commerce be a part of that? That is part of
Right. And go ahead.
that is part of how we address that, and to a certain degree, also that is kind of the core of America on some level because it's about the idea of everybody trying to bring their A game, and we don't just assume a specific solution state and yay verily go forward with that and we'll hammer everybody into shape.
Right. I think too. I guess it's important to kind of be supportive of the space solar power thing. That you say that there's a solution set or a solution state here. Um, for fusion, the solution state would be scaling from an experiment that has produced a little more energy coming out than a little more energy coming in to the ability to actually build reactors and not just the ability, actually demonstrating them, having them online, operating them, and then scaling that to where you could put them out into society and, you know, and eventually, I guess, you end up with a DeLorean that's got a fusion engine in the back. Okay. Um, Space solar power, it's a different solution set in that we know it works. It's been demonstrated. There's been power beamed from point to point. We know all of the concepts work. The solar part of it works, the beaming works, the collection works, the distribution works. So it's merely the mechanics of putting that system together, the key element of which is low cost transportation to space, um, which then would enable it hugely. It's not the only element of it, but that would enable it. Um, and so it's a different thing. One of them is going from because you made this point. I'm just clarifying the point you made earlier. You're going from this theoretical. You move slightly north of theoretical to the point where you're like, okay, we're getting energy out. Now we have to do all the other steps to get to the point of making it commercial. Space solar power is missing one piece, and that is low cost transportation to space in terms
Well, on
of
the other side of this coin
economic viability.
is also
Go ahead.
how do you take the idea of either of these two projects to solve climate change and turn them into a system that is commercialized. And that means you have to approach them from a regulatory standpoint. You have to approach them from a safety standpoint. You have to approach them from, an economic standpoint, which we've already you mentioned already. And all those things get really complicated really fast. It's easy to focus on kind of to assume there's one single shot solution state, but like a fundamental question that has not been addressed in the world of space solar power is how do you regulate it? There is a lot of different ideas out there about how you can regulate it. I have my own personal opinions on that. But
What do you mean by regulation?
so you have to. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember exactly where it stands, but there's laws that basically say that the government has to assure a certain amount of safety on these
Safety.
on these
Okay.
issues. You can't beam. You know, the short version is you can't have death rays shooting down at the ground, or else you can't buy insurance and you can't get all those kind of things going on. Now, space solar power, I have to stipulate this, or else many of my other friends will get mad at me. space solar power beaming is not a death ray,
Yes, thank you. I was about to jump in there. Okay,
so it's not a death
go
ray.
ahead.
But the point is you still have to demonstrate that it's not going to hurt people, that birds can fly through it and without problems. The same thing applies actually to nuclear power. We haven't built a nuclear power plant in decades. So to build a new nuclear power plant, even a fusion power plant, we have to assume a certain amount of regulatory infrastructure that people are not really ready for. So this issue of solving the climate crisis with, whether it's fusion power, whether it's space solar power, whether it's anything that is big industry power, we'll put it that way, because like it's one thing to have solar powers on your personal roof. It's a whole different ballgame when you start talking about factories and malls and you know giant multi-acre facilities that just need a lot of power and are power suck areas. You need industrial scale power there, and realistically, space solar power and fusion power, in my mind, are the real solutions for those kind of activities. So you
Yeah.
have to address these issues on a multi-phase front. Whether you have to make certain the tech works. You have to make certain that the regulatory infrastructure is there. You have to make sure that you can buy insurance for these things. I mean, crap happens where something it all falls apart. 3 Mile Island happened. We've had satellites crash into each other and that kind of a thing. All these things require insurance. And it goes on
Mhm.
and on and on. And ultimately, you have to address it in a multi-phase fashion where you can handle all of these different issues.
So, in terms of a space policy conversation, how would you differentiate that whole list of other things that you just talked about, the regulations and all of that, from the policy? What would the policy look like that enables this to happen versus all of these other things?
The policy. So my starting point is an idea that Beyond Earth Institute came up with last year, I want to say, where they said we need a national strategy on space solar power. You want to bring in the Department of Energy. You want to bring in the Office of Space Commerce. You want to bring in the FAA. You want to bring in, because FAA, I should stipulate for those who don't know, the Federal Aviation Administration regulates launch and reentry under the Office of Space Transportation.
Okay.
Um, you want to bring in NASA, obviously. You want to bring in Space Force, and have kind of a start, because all these agencies tend to stovepipe from each other. They tend to not talk to each other generally, unless you have somebody saying, yes, you will talk to each other. Yes, you will build an organization that engages with other agencies. We call it stovepiping, and a lot of these agencies just like the stovepipe, and it's just that's not necessarily a good or bad. It's generally seen as a bad thing, but it's not necessarily an evil thing. I should stipulate that up front, because it's just kind of the way
Mhm.
bureaucracy develops, and you have to accept that bureaucracy develops in a certain way. And so, by starting point of saying all these organizations, you need to start talking to each other about how to make space solar power a priority in your agency. Then you can start saying, okay, what are the technical hurdles we have to handle? And you go and address those. What are the regulatory hurdles we have to handle? And you go and address those. What are the
Mhm.
what are the legal issues that may need updating that require congressional action? Go address those. That's kind of where I would start from is let's have this national strategy on space solar power, and then engage the different agencies, bring them together, and have them start talking to each other. Maybe ideally having an entity within each agency that is responsible for space solar power, and that's a starting point, just as a beginning of stage of, okay, well, we're starting to think about how to do regulation, and who, you know, one of the big fights going on right now that is related to this is who is the ultimate oversight entity of space activity. Right now, there is three different agencies that handle regulation in space. FAA, the FAA handles launch and reentries. The Office of Space Commerce handles um, remote sensing issues, and the FCC handles communication satellites. There is a desire to have one entity be the overall arching for non-traditional, what they call non-traditional space commerce activities. So things like space mining, space solar power satellites, space tourism, on orbit servicing, those kind of things. And there's a big fight about who should have that authority. And it's one of those things of like, if you have the agencies talking to each other, you're more likely to come to an agreement. Whether that'll happen or not is an open question. I know there's a push within the Biden administration, and I know they did something just prior to Christmas, and unfortunately, I didn't follow it because it was Christmas time, and I have, as you know, Rick, I have two twins that are 4.5 years
Mm-hmm.
old, and they kept me very busy. So I haven't actually followed that latest development. But there's this push to kind of address these issues and make regulation such that, I should say, regulation and policy such that it can address this issue of, on orbit activity that is non-traditional space activity.
Got it. Got it. So the policy is basically the overarching thrust of a government to get something done. And then within that is the strategies, the regulations, the changing the
Exactly.
infrastructure, all of those things. The policy is the top level, uh,
I have friends who would
non-specific.
disagree with me on how that's characterized, but I would agree with that characterization.
Okay, good. Well, as long as I'm saying it, it's correct. So thanks for listening to that segment. We're going to be back in a minute. My name is Rick Tomlinson with my guest, Aaron Oesterle. You are listening to IROC Space Radio, and this is the Space Revolution. All right, you're back. My name is Rick Tomlinson. You are listening to the Space Revolution on IROC Space Radio, part of the iHeartRadio network. And our guest is Aaron Oesterle, space policy expert, behind the scenes, get it done guy in DC extraordinaire, and an old friend. So, Aaron, I'm going to run through a couple of different things, random. I sent you a list way too late, right before the show. So I'm not going to expect you to give me an essay on each one. When it comes to an overarching policy, what do you think the U.S. government's policy should be on orbital debris? Excuse me. People have talked about trashing the solar system, and um, we have to take care of, make sure that George Clooney and you know movie stars in space don't get hit by debris. How do we do that?
So orbital debris is one of those things that's really complicated, and we have a lot of stuff up there. It's invariably it suffers from the problem of being that you have to deal with a lot of different countries that are not necessarily feeling buddy buddy towards each other. And yes, the big ones being right now America and Russia, and China's in there as well too. But Russia's the bigger one, frankly. And so, how you address those issues is really complicated, and I don't have a good answer for you. I'm not focused on the issue of orbital debris, but it's a big problem. I personally think that you have to involve some amount of government or international government, intergovernmental agencies that come together and focus on how to address it in a fashion that takes, we're going to see whether it's like a system of for a for-profit system that takes down trash and brings it down, or a recycling system or something like that. one of the interesting ideas I've heard is that you could have it all go towards one of the Lagrange points and have it kind of build up there, and then you can just go to that point and start recycling stuff from there, and thus you don't have it kind of everywhere. You have it in one centralized location. I don't know whether that's viable or not. That's a technical solution that I don't have a good answer on. I always like to say I'm a policy guy, not really a rocket scientist anymore, because you want me around when your stuff crashes into each other, but you don't want me designing it because I will cause it to crash into stuff. So
That's fair. That's fair. Unlike me, because I pretend I'm an expert on everything. Actually, I just hang out with them. Um, yeah, I mean, I was looking at some stuff Mariba Jaw had written recently. Mariba is part of Steve Wozniak's new company that I just blanked on the name of.
Prospector,
And uh, Privateer.
privateer.
Privateer. Yeah. And they're focusing in on orbital debris, which is interesting because that means he thinks there's a commercial angle there. Or it wouldn't be a company rather than a not for profit. Um, but it was interesting because Mariba, who's been a champion of this for a long time, wrote something, and I found myself agreeing with like everything he said in this written interview, which is very rare with anybody except myself, of course. And you know, some of the ideas we were looking at, you have talked about some of these. I've talked about some of them. Mariba's talked about some of them, but not allowing random disposal of spacecraft in space, creating laws that would enable salvage, because right now the launching state that the company is located in or owned by is in charge of and responsible for that piece of hardware from launch to return to Earth or loss or whatever. There's no mechanism for being able to hand that off. So you can't salvage. It would seem like the laws of the sea have pretty well set that up. There'd be some things you could maybe even, I wouldn't say cut and paste, but you could move over. Um, Identifying, one of my favorite ones, well, I'll come back to that in a second. Creating junkyards, which you talked about, where you don't down orbit. In other words, burn things up on Earth, you move them up and store them. And I think one that's very important, and you had mentioned this in the beginning of your answer, that there are a lot of states that don't get along, and that would be the idea of penalizing countries that purposefully create debris by doing an anti-satellite test or blowing something up, and creating sanctions, strong sanction against those kind of companies. The the one about storing things, and that I was about to mention too, the idea of recognizing those that are historic and protecting those. This gets into, I'm going to segue into the next one. I'm curious about your opinion on, and as you know, I've been starting to throw down on "Thou shalt not deorbit the space station," and my goal, as you know, I've participated in space station um, stuff for a long time. I mean, at one point, I wanted the International Space Station canceled. Now I don't want to see it deorbited. At one point, I led a team. We took over the Mir space station. We lost the battle, and it got deorbited by Putin in his first iteration as head of Russia. Um, as we move into this debate, what are your thoughts on um, how we would go about setting the groundwork, creating the policies, as it were, that would enable us to keep the space station up?
So the problem you have with keeping the space station up is that a lot of the space station companies out there, or the conglomerations that are trying to do commercial space stations, they see the space station as a threat. They see ISS as a threat, and to they've talked about like different things you could theoretically do, but all of them really don't want the space station still there because they see it as a threat to their business climate. They want NASA to commit to doing. It's kind of like, for lack of a better phrase, it's kind of like the shuttle. Until there was an end date for shuttle, it was always going to be very hard for commercial crew and commercial cargo to get off the ground. Um, it's just it they're so diametrically in different directions. That's the viewpoint. Now, do I think there's value in saving something like ISS? I do. I think there are things you could do with it, but I think that unless and until the commercial space station companies acknowledge that, I think it'll get deorbited.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, I differentiate between ending its life and whether you deorbit it or you uporbit it to that Lagrange scrapyard that you talked about so that it can be a historical monument.
I understand
I
what you're
think that's
saying.
the part of the conversation that's being missed.
The problem is they don't trust NASA because NASA
Oh my God. Why?
their viewpoint, for better or worse, at least this is my how I would characterize their viewpoint. Again, I'm not speaking for anybody but myself, but my understanding and my from my interactions with them, their attitude kind of is that NASA will never let go of what it currently has until something forces it, and it really has to be a strong forcing function where they can't get it back. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and if you start talking about up orbiting it, well, we can push that off, and maybe we can start doing something like that. The reality, I think, is much more likely is there's going to be an accident on ISS, and then we will start having a real conversation about a post ISS world. Because I'm not convinced we're having the right conversation yet about a post ISS world and what to do with ISS. And I don't know if that'll happen until and unless there's a major accident on board ISS, which is not what I want to happen, but that's what happened with Space Shuttle.
Mm-hmm. 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 No, I understand that. I think, and this is great. You're informing me. You gave me a thought here too. That we really need to get in and lay out the path before we go in and start pushing for the policies. Start laying out the path that creates an end state that enables the private companies to get their stations up and rolling. NASA to declare that they're done with the station, and does so in a way that enables us to keep the station for future generations. I call it a universal heritage site. Um, Maybe salvage parts of it. Maybe you could buy the solar panels or whatever. They're probably degraded by then, but something, you could salvage off some of it. But there's an end state that makes it clear to everybody that there will be no more human beings going into the space station at this point, and now you can start your business, right? And then we're done. So going to the private space companies is probably one of the first steps, getting them to buy in. So, guys, here's a path. What do you think?
Again, this goes back to I think that you could come to an agreement along something like that, but there is this issue of can you trust NASA? And there's a lot. I should stick to. There's a lot of good people and a lot of pro space revolution people at NASA, but there's also a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of people whose attitude is we have this thing and I need to hold on to it as long as I can because if I don't, I can't trust that the if I can actually jump further back and further out. My former boss and and your good buddy Jim Muncie, um, he uh, he argues that a lot of NASA's neuroses kind of and bureaucratic learning curve can be explained by childhood trauma. Because if you think about it, NASA came about in the Apollo era. It was a real young group of people who were put together to solve going to the moon, and then they took it all away from them. The budget was slashed. There were all these grand plans to have a moon base by 1980 and going to Mars in 1990 and all those kind of things, and all those budgets got slashed to the hilt by various people or by various presidents, and there is and that just was such trauma that they always want to hold on to what they currently have. They don't want to lose what they currently have because their viewpoint is that they could lose everything. Now, that kind
Mm-hmm.
of thing I'm skeptical on, but that is the viewpoint. That is the worry is if you take this away, you lose all of it. So
Mm-hmm. So
go ahead.
go ahead. No, I was just funny because it's like if you want to see what that would have looked like, I guess you could watch For All Mankind, right? Like yeah, the scenario where NASA keeps going.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Maybe that's the argument then why some people at NASA are pushing the what they call the Gateway, the Lunar Gateway space station. That many people wonder what the hell is that for. Maybe it's a way to give them something to hang on to that they have, even as the private sector rolls in. So you like just change the sign on your desk, International Space Station. Oh, okay, that's over. Now I'm working on the Gateway out by the moon. My job continuity is assured.
And of course, you have to remember also that in all of this is the discussion about what the contractors are going to be doing, because the contractors drive a lot of discussion as well. How much money is going to the various companies who are dependent upon the space station for their business model? If that goes away, do those
Mhm.
companies go away?
And that's Gateway then, right? That means they
Theoretically,
just
some of
shift
it,
contracts to Gateway.
some of them would, but you might not have all of them. And to be fair, if we want gateway, this is the issue that I know this is an area where you and I have a little bit of disagreement. Um, but this is the issue that we have with SLS fundamentally is we have the Space Launch System, and its sole purpose is to protect existing contractors. And there were ways to address that issue of making it more commercially viable back in the day. Um, I led a I started a small project called Commercial Booster, and the idea was we would have a commercial competition for the boosters of the SLS. So maybe you could imagine an SLS with Falcon 9 boosters on it, or Atlas 5 boosters on it, or SRBs on it, and it would be a commercial boot, and that part of it would be purely commercial. It's not a perfect solution, obviously, because you still have a lot of the independent existing contractors you're supporting with it, but it does make it more commercial, and it does support the commercial industry, and everybody, there's a bigger win there. Um, and you want that kind of, you want to have, if we want to get to the revolution we all want, we have to have a transition strategy where we do end some of these activities that we currently do. Not all of them, because there's a lot of great activities that are, you're never going to have something like Hubble or the James Webb Space Telescope or the the Pluto mission. I'm blanking on the name, um, but where that is not a cost plus contract. They just is not viable for a variety of reasons. You can do more. You can definitely do them more efficiently, and you can focus on what you're trying to do in a better fashion. But you're not going to get rid of some of the existing structures, because there's no marketplace for a probe to Pluto right now. Maybe someday in 100 years or so, but not right now. But I think there's great science that could
Mhm.
be done, and we should do that, pursue that science. So you need to have the strategy of moving away from the command and control systems for large portions of NASA activity.
Mhm. So the bottom line on that then is inertia. You have to deal with the inertia
Exactly.
of an existing infrastructure when you're coming in with something new, because you have NASA people whose whole lives have been built around this project. You have aerospace contractors who built their business model on it. You have people who have jobs in a particular community whose whole job is adding widget Z to widget Q that builds part of
Yep.
the space station and all of that. So it's a very complex thing. So we're taking a policy. We're saying, okay, we need to put the space station up into a different place and store it and do all this. But we have these new companies coming in to build private space stations. But it's a very, very complicated path to make that kind of thing happen. All right, very good. I hope people are learning that the things they see and hear about in the news, and we just can't wave our hands. I mean, I'm a hand waver. I admit it. I'm a screamer. I'm a yeller. Let's go do it. Let's go do it. You're the pragmatic side of things. You're the guy who has to actually make that thing happen. So, all right, we're talking to Aaron Oesterle, and you're listening to iRock Space Radio. My name is Rick Tumlinson, and this is the Space Revolution, and we'll be right back. All right, you're back with the Space Revolution. We are wonking out here. We're doing some DC wonking. We're talking about policies. We're getting deep into it in 2 or 3 different examples. We've talked about the space station. We've talked about orbital debris. We've talked about space solar power. Some very major and challenging issues. And underneath them, as I hope you're beginning to understand, we have this very complex thing of how do you translate these policies into reality, which our guest, Aaron Oesterle, is an expert at. Aaron, moving forward, let's say you're working on space solar power. What's the big policy thing that you want to work on that, would really get you excited next? Is there one that you're thinking about, area you'd like to focus in on? And by the way, anybody who's listening who wants to support what Aaron's doing, reach out to the Space Frontier Foundation and feel free to offer a donation in support of Aaron's space policy work. Be very specific. So I want to support Aaron Oesterle and space policy at the Space Frontier Foundation, and make that donation. And it's, by the way, a not-for-profit charitable donation.
Yeah,
There, I plugged for you.
it's a 501c3 organization. So to your question, Rick, what would I like to work on? That's a hard one because, like, I knew what it was 10 years ago. I wanted to work on commercial space stations, but the battle is happening now for commercial space stations in my mind, and it's not. It's moved in a direction that I'm not necessarily certain is the healthiest, um, but it is what it is. So I'm kind of like I'm not thrilled by that by commercial space stations anymore. I want to see them. Don't get me wrong. I want to see them succeed. They need to succeed. And if somebody came to me and said, "Aaron, here's $1 million and go fight for commercial space stations," I'd do it. I would probably do it in a heartbeat. But what I would do
Hang
after,
on just a second. Let me stop you for just a second. I think what you're trying to say, help me, I'm putting words in your mouth, is that you're about elite. You're the guy who gets out there. Like I get out there. I'm like Will Ferrell in Old School. Like, let's go streaking, and I run down the street naked, and hopefully people are following me. Right? You're a very pragmatic guy, but you also engage in the leading edge and laying the foundational groundwork for what's coming and getting ahead of things. So it's not that you don't like commercial space stations or anything. It's like you've kind of done a lot of your work there. You've done the job,
the job isn't
and you need to be
finished.
acknowledged.
I'd say one thing to
Mm-hmm.
modify what you're saying. The job isn't finished, but there are aspects of where the debate is that I don't find healthy.
Mm-hmm.
For me personally, and for industry, and for our species, it's sad, but there's just aspects of the debate that I think are missing key points. I mean, one of them being the space station, the ISS. Like I think it is a shame to lose that piece, but we're going to lose that piece, and probably because of you know bureaucratic dynamics, and that's a shame. But that's one example. So, but I like to be on the leading edge of things, and I like to find the next great debate. It's interesting. I've had a conversation with a bunch of other people, what they think the next great debate is going to be, and nobody's come up with it. And so I'm kind of like looking around for it. I think a big part of it has to be how does space address issues that are fundamental to individual human beings? How does space become important to the average person? And that's a little bit hand wavy, and I don't like that answer. But there's this attitude of we see space like the Mona Lisa, where space is this thing that we do, and it's great for all nations, and sometimes really rich people do it, but the average person just kind of watches it and it's cool. I want more than that for the average person. I want the average person to say, not only is that cool, I can do it. I can be a part of it. I can, form a business. I can go and paint stuff in space. I can be touched by it in a way that is inspirational. I can be part of the story of space. And that's what drives me, and finding that kind of thing. That's kind of why I latched on to the idea of space, solar power, and climate change, because I see climate change as one of the quintessential issues we face. And if this is an opportunity to address that issue for the average person, that's not a bad thing.
It isn't. It isn't at all. At another point in another time, I want to talk to you about the work that we did years ago, a couple of times actually, but especially in 2014, 2015, on what we called the Space Settlement Act, and the Pioneering Space Summit, where we brought these people together to get them to agree to put the word settlement into the authorization, or the top level guiding policy for NASA. Um, I'm coming back around to that idea because I think we were able to help change the conversation. There was a whole flurry of uh, citizens living in space type legislation, including asteroid stuff and resource stuff and all that followed uh, right after. I mean, within the year of that happening. Um, but I still believe the idea that at the very top, without that being the guiding policy of NASA to enable, and by the way, I'm not using the word settlement, I'm trying to not use it as much, but the establishment of human communities beyond Earth. It's a little more ponderous, but a little more politically correct nowadays. Um, that until that is in there, in terms of what human spaceflight is for, government funded human spaceflight is for or supports the idea of enabling the development of human communities beyond the Earth, we're always going to be picking around the edges
Well,
and trying to torque this and torque that.
well, it's
What do you think
interesting.
about
This is a
that?
this is a fundamental issue that you see in government policymakers. I haven't, but one of our mutual friends has had a discussion with a government official on the issue of space settlement and beyond Earth communities. And the question he got asked was, "Well, what program would you have us do?" And his response, our friend's response was, "This isn't about a specific program. This is about a mindset and an approach of doing business differently. And therefore, don't think of it as asking for a specific program. Think of it as how it informs your existing programs and your future programs, whether it's going to Mars, whether it's building a space telescope, whether it's whatever."
I think that's perfect. Yeah, and it gets down to some of the things that I'm working on with the Earthlight Foundation and the book that I hope to get out at some point, where everything that NASA would do, let's say NASA or the government or Space Force, whatever would do, if that were the policy, that the government's human space program activities should support the development of human communities beyond the Earth, then you would look at everything they do and say, well, how does this help? Is this, how do we turn this from spending on a program to an investment in creating American led human space communities? And that means going back to what we were talking about, salvage rights. When you're done with something, you can hand it over. Developing things that are reusable, bringing the private sector in wherever you can, all of these different things. So I think you're exactly right. It's not a program, it's how you approach all programs. So at some point, we can have a much deeper conversation on that. I need to get into some very, very serious topics now because we're
Okay.
getting near the end of the show. And kind of traditional thing I like to do here. And and definitely I'm going to have you back. We're just touching the surface here of so many different things we could dive into. And I hope the audience is interested and excited about what they're hearing. And if you are, let us know. You can follow me, by the way, at Rocket Rick. And Aaron doesn't do very much social media. That's because he's getting S done. But so Aaron, very important topic. You're out flying around let's call it, you're flying around Mars, mm, several tens of thousands of kilometers an hour. You can see the surface moving below you. It's very, very immediate to you. What would you be listening to?
So I have a story to tell that I think you'll appreciate on this. Back when I was in high school, we had to do one of our projects. Don't ask me why. Was to create a travel brochure or something commercial, whatever you wanted to do. But you had to create some sort of travel kit about why you're visiting a certain planet, and we got Mars. And we
Mm.
created a commercial for going to Mars, and we borrowed images from Buzz Aldrin's Mars Cycler and the space station and different things like that. And this is in the '90s before the space we had the space station, and images of the X-33 and the Venture Star. I'm sure you remember those. And we had a whole
Hmm.
thing about going to Mars, and we set it to the music of um, Babylon 5, trailer music for Judge Dredd, and I think we also used a little bit of the planets, specifically the Mars one. Um,
Hmm.
the I can't think of who created that symphony, but the Planet Symphony that was done many years ago. So
Hmm.
we had a mixture of that.
Was
So
that
I would probably be listening
Dvorak?
to weird.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
I don't remember it, but anyway, I would probably be listening to weird trailer music because that's what I or weird uh weird that kind of music because that's what I listen to a lot. That or weird pop.
Okay. Okay. I love it. I love it. What's your favorite science fiction movie?
I'm not a movie person actually. I mean, I guess I would have to say Star Wars, but I'm more of a TV person. So
Hmm. Or
I
show?
I
Yeah, tell me your
prefer
show. What's your favorite show?
my two favorite shows are Babylon 5 and Farscape. I loved the
Wow.
realism and the storytelling of Babylon 5 and the world building it did, and I loved the weirdness of Farscape. They had so many new ideas in Farscape that were hadn't been touched, and it was just beautifully done.
Hmm. A lot of weird characters, and that's a Wayback Machine show. You should look that up if you haven't heard of it. Farscape. Um, very very cool. Favorite book?
Uh,
Fiction.
Foundation series. I love the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov.
Hmm. And as you know, the Space Frontier Foundation was partially named in honor of that series, and Isaac knew and he liked it. Of course, the joke was, and those of you who read the Foundation series will know this little inside thing here, where's the second Foundation? Anyway, so what about nonfiction? There's only one answer. I'm going to tell you what it is. It's the High Frontier.
I
But
was
what's
going to
your
say it was
second
your book,
favorite
isn't
book?
it?
Oh, the book I haven't written. Oh my God, you're going for points, my friend. All right, I owe you points on that one. Um, Beyond the High Frontier, which is obvious for us, and I'm not putting words in your mouth there. I know it is obvious. It's the Bible for a lot of us. What would
Well,
another
the great irony is I
nonfiction?
never finished The High Frontier.
Wow,
I will.
and yet you
I'm weird
operate in
like
a
that. Like
world
I
of it.
I do, but I've never finished it. I started it many times and I just never finished it. It's one of those things of like something comes up or whatever, but I've never finished it.
That's almost as good as when I asked somebody what their favorite music was, and they said silence. Right? Okay, and you can buy that where? Um, you can download it on the Apple. Um, no, very very cool, man. And last point, somebody listening who wants to get into this field, who cares about it, who wants to make something happen somewhere in the world, maybe not just here in the United States, but somewhere in the world. Maybe there's somebody in the Philippines listening, or you know, somewhere else who wants to get involved. What would you say to them? How do you do it?
Start by learning how your government works. Number one, you know, know how the powers of the levers of power are pushed and pulled and turned and whatnot. That's one number one. Number two, start learning about how you know the idea of this intermixture of commerce and regulation and technology happen in an interesting way. Because I the reality is I did not learn space policy by going to school. I learned it in the sticks. I had about 10 years where I was trying to do my undergrad work, and I had family issues and personal issues that came up, and it took 10 years. Now, and it is what it is. I don't make a big deal out of it. But in that time, I learned space policy because you had the world of the blogosphere come online, and you had people posting their thoughts on issues of orbital debris and space station and space shuttle and the end of space shuttle and all those kind of things. And I just started reading those kind of things. So learn how your government works, learn how civics works, learn how you want the government to work, and then start thinking about these issues of how they interconnect with each other and how the interplay is with each other. That's vital. And start reading about those kind of things, whether it's policy books, or I'm going to give a plug for Lori Garver's new book. Read her book. There's a lot of good things like that out there that you can avail yourself of. But learn how your government works, and then start developing how you want it to work.
Fantastic. Well, you're certainly a guy who has learned how it works, and you work it very, very well, my friend. Want to thank Aaron Oesterle for being our guest today. Like I said, we're going to have you back. We're going to play around with some of these different topics. I think we had a list of like 9, and we did 3. So there's so much to talk about, and hopefully our spacer team out there has learned something. I'm glad to have you anytime, and I hope
It's an honor and a pleasure,
23
Rick.
turns out. Oh man, I'm gonna have to send you a check. So, Aaron Oesterle, thank you. Spacers, thank you. You've been listening to the Space Revolution. My name is Rick Tumlinson. We are here on iRock Space Radio. We're part of the iHeart Radio network, and yeah, come back around. Come back around next time the orbit brings you here. And I am out of the airlock.